is I think you only need to give bad speakers really long introductions, and Megan is among the best speakers that I think you'll see certainly this year. So Megan's a senior research sociologist at RTI International. She's going to talk a lot about sort of the work that she's doing that fits really, really nicely within the context of the sorts of things that we're trying to move more and more toward in terms of faculty involvement in BCTR. And so I think it's a really great thing for all of us to hear. In some of her earlier work, which I think she's not going to talk about quite as much, she wrote a book called Doing Time Together, which is a study of women who are managing the long-term imprisonment of their romantic partners. And I have to say, those of you who know me well know that I basically hate everything, and it is like literally the one book in the subfield that I love and have read like again and again and again. So with that, I'm going to scoot. But anyway, Megan's going to crush it. It's going to be great. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you all. That was quite an introduction. So it's very nice to be here. Thanks to Chris, who just left, and to Patty and to Carl, who helped facilitate my visit here. I think none of them are in the room, but I'm glad you all are. So good to have people here. I'm really glad to be here. And I am really excited to talk about this topic today. I want to acknowledge, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, right? Like, you're all involved in the Center for Translational Research, so you all know about this stuff, believe in it. But I wanted to just kind of talk through some of my involvement with it. And really, I'm actually going to be highlighting a lot of examples of people I know who I feel have done this work really nicely over the years. I have worked in interdisciplinary soft money environments for my whole career. So I started out at the University of California, San Francisco, which is a university, but 98% of the faculty there are on soft money funding. And now I'm at RTI International, which is also a lot of contract and grant work. And the reason I bring that up is I just think those environments are slightly different than a lot of traditional academic areas in that we do really put a high price tag on the importance of translating research to many different kinds of audiences. So that is what I'll be talking about today. As I say, I've had an opportunity to learn from a lot of amazing people, particularly in the field of public health, who have been doing this kind of work for a long time. So there are a couple of chairs over here, too, if anybody needs anything or if people come in. And wonderful. Wow. This is fun. So what I thought is I'm just going to start with some kind of basic slides about like translating research. Why does it matter? Again, I want to acknowledge that you all are, not people who need to have that explained to you, but just kind of talking through why we can start thinking about explaining to other people why translating research matters, right? So there's probably consensus that this is a great time to really be thinking about issues like this, and maybe it never there's never been a time when it's mattered more to think about how research can enter into kind of what we call the real world, or into the community, or into the public. Wow, I'll give people, there's a chair here, if anybody needs a chair. Sure. Feel free to hear. We'll get settled. So, thinking about like a time when we really need research, both to keep the world tethered to science and evidence, but also in terms of promoting a respect for and an understanding of research, right? As we enter a time when some prominent people in our nation are maybe questioning the value of research, it is a great time to explain to people why research is valuable, what it's all about, how it actually works, demystify that process so that we can have more people on board with us. Again, a very basic thing that people in this room already know, but research can and in fact should help inform policy decisions, directing resources, kind of helping us figure out the world. This is just an example. I will acknowledge I just grabbed this off the internet. You will notice that down here it's hard to read, but it says there's 1 in 3.64 billion chance of being killed by a refugee in the United States. Chance of being killed by a refugee in America has been calculated by an independent institute as this figure. So independent institute not named, that kind of makes me think this is just an image, so please don't take this picture and run with it. But the general idea that if we have research we can rely on, that we know where it came from, these are good numbers, this can help us see, like, where is it important to spend our resources, right? Where are resources best spent? Where can we have an impact? Are there certain things that are really hard to move the needle on, whereas other things can happen more quickly? We have the research that shows an evidence-based practice for that, where we can, research can guide us in those ways. What are the issues that truly affect people's lives and need to be addressed, right? Again, kind of calming down some moral panics about things that might sound very frightening, but in fact don't affect a lot of us. and directing resources towards things that maybe people don't talk about very often, but in fact are really important and are affecting quality of life on a day-to-day basis. So translating research in terms of broad policies, but I also, again, kind of come from this model where we really highlight and take on board our obligation as researchers to the people who participate in our research. So people who participate in research deserve to find out what was learned about them in their community, and I do think we have an ethical obligation to figure out how to translate that back to them, right? Like, they translated their experiences to us, which we asked them to do, then what did we learn and what do they need to know about what we learned that can help? So the small print on this is not important, prevent childhood lead poisoning, but it's a great example of when communities need to know what's happening. What did we detect the lead levels to be here? What did we learn about the effects of lead poisoning? As I say, I've worked a lot in a public health environment, so I think these kinds of obligations are all the more vital and are very transparent in that kind of environment, but we can think about it with many forms of research, right? Like, none of you are going to undertake a research project thinking that what you learn is really not that important. You're going to think it's important for a reason. Most likely it's important because it affects people. The people who are affected by it need to hear about it. And then there's also just the ethical issue around this, I would argue, in a social justice sense of sharing knowledge and of not going to places, asking people for things, their information, their personal stories, their data, and running and building our careers on it and feeling important amongst ourselves and not sharing back that information and that data. Yeah, people feel free. There's actually, like, space up here. I can move this table, too. Does anybody want to come more up here? Yeah, windowsills. Great. I should have said before, too, I've timed this to leave room for discussion and questions, but if anybody has any clarifying questions as I go along, I do get excited about these issues and I might talk faster. Forget that I haven't already told you something, so feel free to interrupt with anything that I haven't been covering well. Another reason why I think translating research matters is that people who are members of or who are working in researched communities can use research to obtain necessary resources. So we were talking about before, kind of policy informing and those types of things. As we know, that often takes a long time, right? But in the interim, things that we learn about communities, one, as I say, from a public health standpoint, if we find out something's dangerous and are important, right now, people need to know that. But even in terms of something, can people use the information you found in a grant application? Can they use it as part of their social, advocacy campaign? I think all the work that's been done around food justice and these food deserts is really important that way, right? So can people just use concrete data findings from their communities to build the case that they need and deserve and would benefit from resources? And that might, again, take a form that's not a peer-reviewed article, but something more tailored to them. And then one last reason that I think about, not to say that I've created an exhaustive list of why this matters, but just in general, people, again, who are members of or who are working in researched communities are important research partners. There is the model of community-based participatory research, which I'm sure people are familiar with, which is a very, engaged and very, there's a lot that's actually written about how you do that and how you do it well. And I want to acknowledge that sometimes that's not possible, right? Sometimes your resources aren't in that direction. Sometimes you're not going to be able to undertake that full level, which can be fine, right? I mean, I love CBPR, but I also understand not every single research project is going to have that as a model. So even when you're not conducting CBPR, people are research partners in the ways that they interact with us as researchers. So again, people just asking someone to give you their knowledge, give you their information, give you their data, that is partnering in research, because if you don't have those people, you don't have any research. But also as people come to understand research better, getting to the point I was saying before, then they start to do some of this translating themselves, right? So people who live in communities that are affected by certain issues can start to bring those issues to your attention as important research questions, or they can help you see a connection between some things that they might know best because they live or work in a certain area that might not be apparent right off the bat. And then it goes in the other direction as well, right? The more people understand research and we've communicated findings to them, the more they can disseminate that amongst people that we might not have contact with. So, as I say, this is a lot of just reviewing what I think you all are already thinking about. In terms of kind of the focus today, so I titled it Beyond the Peer-Reviewed Article. This is in the sense that, you know, a lot of times the full article one is just not an approachable medium for people. It also can be hard to figure out in a peer-reviewed article, like, what has the most immediate translatable consequence for somebody. And I'm going to show you a step-by-step example of that, where somebody, a community partner, used a research finding that was very, very important to them in their campaign around why they were necessary, that, like, doesn't appear in the abstract and probably wouldn't be picked up by a lot of people, right? But it is a research finding. So I want to talk a lot today about audience and how we figure out what audiences need. And I would say also beyond the tweet, and this is not a diss on social media, I think social media is very important. I don't have a big social media presence and admire people who manage to keep that up. So I think there is this sort of like tweeting about your results, tweeting about papers that come out, whatever other social media presence you may have, that's really important. But again, when we come into this audience idea, some people, like between the peer-reviewed article and the tweet, they're going to need our help to zone in on, like, what do you need from this? What is applicable to you? You know, I can't just grab 144 characters and figure out how I'm going to use this in my community-based organization's annual report, right? So this is what I would like to talk about today, as I say, highlighting some things that I and my colleagues and other people I admire have done that I think come in between those two spaces. So we'll start, again, just going back to policymakers. Again, this is kind of the obvious example, but I wanted to just highlight one of them because I think it is extremely important and we shouldn't forget about the policy implications of research that we conduct. So this is a slide that just shows, you know, the beginning of a San Francisco campaign that was around healthy nail salons and, you know, getting nail salons, like incentivizing them to use less toxic products, to have better ventilation, to do all of these things. The reason I'm featuring it is because it was the legislation that led to all of this was introduced by a San Francisco Assemblyperson named David Chu, and I had an opportunity to hear him speak about how he even became interested in this, and it was actually research, right, which was really refreshing. I mean, that was the point of him speaking to us, but he was like, the things that you do are important to us. We need to know about them. No, I don't read journals, and I usually don't read peer-reviewed articles, but if you can get your information to me, you know, through an op-ed, through a policy brief, through a fact sheet. And he was really encouraging researchers to think in this way and kind of come up with like a one-page thing that you can send to your assembly person or the assembly person who's responsible for a district you might be studying or any other policy leverage person you can think of who could use the information. He was saying it's just really worth doing. Like, that's how he gets direction. And it was funny because then I was like, well, let me find the research that led to this. And I went through like pages and pages and like, you know, like way down on this text-heavy article. Right here, it finally says, you know, points to a 2008 study in the Journal of Community Health called A Preliminary Survey of Vietnamese Nail Salon Workers in Alameda County, and then it kind of goes on. So this is the other piece, right? Like, if we have big egos about our work, it's not going to, you're just like, we don't know still who wrote this article, right? There's no actual reference. I mean, we could find it, but, you know, the whole idea that we have to sort of release our hold on information, release our need to always have our name associated with our finding, and just be like, all right, if this policymaker cares about this issue, my research can help advance this agenda, and I'm like good with that. The end result of having, you know, a lot of people work in a healthier environment is worth it to me, then this is how research can get kind of digested and moved along. Which isn't to say that some people won't be able to track back to the actual research, and, you know, maybe David Chu has stayed in touch with these researchers and is like, please continue to, like, let me know about issues. But I do think it's an important point that it is different, and again, speaking to the choir here, but I think something we can support other academics in is valuing this work, right? Like, we should see that this is an important thing, even though it didn't lead to something with, you know, principal investigator's name right on it. So that's kind of the policy side of things. So now, to say, I want to move more into kind of research participants and different ways of keeping people informed. So I'm going to speak here about a study that I conducted with my colleagues that was around HIV testing. We did community-based testing in Alameda County, which is east of San Francisco, and we were doing, as a NIH-funded study, we actually ended up finding many fewer HIV-positive people than we were expecting. So we tested 2,200 people who were just community-based drug users for HIV, and we ended up with a very small prevalence, and we only found 60 people total who tested HIV positive. About 45 of them already knew they were positive, so it was kind of an interesting study in that sense of like, oh, okay, good to know, but that was a lot of work to determine that there's not a lot of HIV in this place that we were looking at. However, we had 2,200 people, street-based recruitment, people who are actively using drugs, many people who were homeless, who came and participated in this study, including having an HIV test, which is not a small thing to ask of people. And the people that we had hired as, who were working with us as field staff on this, one of whom is Tazima Jenkins, who's featured in these photos, and then another man named Askia Mohammed, who did most of the outreach and recruitment, they felt really strongly like we need to let people know what we found, right? Like we're doing all this HIV testing, don't people deserve and need to know kind of, not just that the prevalence rate was actually low, but kind of what do we think contributed to that? What was our interpretation? What are things that you all are doing amazingly well around HIV prevention in your daily lives, given that, you know, we came to these communities thinking these were folks who were at high risk for being infected with HIV. The other piece of this where we talk about community members is Tazima in particular lived in the communities that we were recruiting from, and she also articulated, you know, researchers go home at night to different communities, but I don't. I live here, and I see people on the streets, and I see people who I think are affected by our research, and I don't feel comfortable not getting back to people with the results of the study. Now, part of what was complicated here, I'll show you some social media or like more technology-oriented ways of reporting back. What was a little complicated in this study was that our folks were really disenfranchised. You know, people who had had a cell phone at the time we saw them were probably on their like 5th, 6th, or 7th cell phone by the time we were ready to give them reports back. A lot of people, as I say, weren't housed, so it's not like we could kind of go back to trace people that way. We didn't even take contact information. It was a cross-sectional study. So I had a series of conversations with Tazima about, okay, what do you think would work? Like, how are we going to do this? How are we going to get the results back? In some of the previous work I had done at UCSF, we would do community report backs where there was some sort of central community location, like a rec center or something like that, and we would, you know, advertise for a while and, you know, get people to come. We would serve a meal. We would try to make kind of a fun event out of it and then present research findings back. But that was less appropriate in this study because people weren't really congregating in specific places. And again, they're kind of so marginalized in this study that we weren't sure that people would respond to that kind of recruitment. So what Tazima came up with, and that Askia and I helped her with, was to print up a one-page fact sheet about the study findings, you know, really breaking it down, like what did we find, what do we think it means, you know, why are we grateful for your participation, how did this help advance our knowledge. We packed lunches, and, you know, just simple things, right, just a brown bag lunch, but with a sandwich, piece of fruit, bag of chips, dessert. And we just spent some time going out to all the areas where Askia had been recruiting. Askia is an amazing recruiter, so we actually recruited all 2,200 of those people. And so Askia just directed us around, and we would just go out, and Tazima would go up to people, you know, ask if they had participated in the study. And, you know, do we actually care if they really participated or not? No. The idea is to get the information out. But what was incredibly touching is that both Askia and Tazima recognized a lot of people, and the look on people's faces when they were recognized and like, oh, you participated, I remember you, like, we wanted to come back here and thank you, like, here's what we learned, priceless, right? Like, people were so happy to receive this kind of report back. Did we hit all 2,200 people? No. But I think this idea, you know, we would give people extra flyers if you know anybody else who participated. We tried to put flyers around in places where we were driving through. So I just wanted to, the images here are the top two of Tazima just talking to people whom she recognized and wanted to talk to. And then the bottom photo there is both Tazima and Askia going out to one of the encampments where Askia recruited from. So again, the value of having somebody partnered with us who knows that this is a place to go, to find people in the first place to recruit for research and to go back to report back. So that was one model for getting results back to a community when kind of more organized technological or meeting type interventions were probably not going to do the trick for us. Pause there in case there are any questions. Yeah?
What was the advice to get people to research?
In the first place, we do, all of our research studies are funded, and we always put in the funding to pay people for their participation. I'm glad you asked the question because we actually feel very strongly about this within my group and our team. that people deserve to get compensated for their time, and there's often a lot of like, well, if you give people money, what are they going to spend it on? You know, and we just want to acknowledge, like, oh, these are grown people. Most of the people we're interviewing are having really tough lives. They should spend this on whatever they decide they need to spend it on. So we don't, you know, it's not a huge incentive. People usually get about $20 for a survey, more if it's sort of a more complicated, you know, 30 to 40 for, say, a longer interview or an HIV test in there with that. But we do compensate people for their time. Anything else on this one? There's more. So this is a study that someone I know, a friend of mine, full disclosure, who's at the San Francisco Department of Public Health is running. It's called the SHINE study, and it's for anyone, I'm reading their recruitment text down there, anyone aged 16 to 24 who is assigned a male sex at birth and who identifies as something other than male now, so female, transgender, genderqueer, et cetera. This is their kind of little recruitment flyer. But the reason I wanted to highlight this is I just think these folks have done a brilliant job with a website that I'm going to take you to at keeping current research participants informed, but also pitching at like lots of different levels of what people might need. So if we move from kind of the people we saw in the study I just described, who most likely are not going to be spending a lot of time on a website, to folks in the SHINE study who are. There's no reason to think they wouldn't. That's good. So this is the SHINE study homepage. We'll stay here long enough probably for it changes color. So I just think it's very visually appealing. You know, it's kind of a cool idea of how to do things. On this first page, you know, there's just the welcome to the SHINE study. Here's who we are. You know, very smart recruitment and retention here, right? If you're a part of the SHINE study, you can always contact us to see if you have an appointment coming up. So this is also a way of keeping people engaged in the actual, like, please show up. They give phone numbers, they give web page, how to stay connected. So that's great and smart, and a lot of studies do things like that. There we go, see, changes color very fancy. But they have the team on here, which again, just now starting to think about what does it even mean to translate research. Like, I really appreciate this as a way for most people who are participating in research are just going to see the person who interviews them, or maybe the person who recruits and interviews them. But like, who is that person who's leading this study, right? Well, it's Erin, who's right here. And, you know, you can click on her, you can find out who she is, what does she do. You know, and again, this is a nice, I think this is a great level of information, right? Like, it's the comprehensive bio for people who are interested, but it's not like, here's my 25-page CV. And then something they've done as well that I really like on here is everybody says their favorite colors. So Dr. Wilson's favorite colors are black and gold. It just kind of humanizes a little bit. This is Sean, who's their project director. I always like him because, so he's a graduate student, which I think is another thing that's really important in the SHINE study, is they're really capturing a very broad range of socioeconomic groups, and so they have people who are kind of very marginalized, like homeless youth, but up to, you know, people who are thinking of going to grad school or who are in grad school. So just the presence of being able to see, again, like who are these people, where do they come from, is really important. So I think it's great to have everybody on there, but nice for Sean. And then I love Sean's favorite colors, which are sunshine and leather. So I think the transparency of the team is awesome. Then we come over, and for people who are farther back and can't see, so you also can access the entire website in Spanish, which is another great thing. So then we have a resources page, which is about like local, concrete, practical information. So to say they're hitting this huge range, you know, homeless youth might be accessing this in a public library, right? And it's really great to have, and we usually give some sort of resource flyer or way of accessing things at the time of interviewing somebody. But I just love it that SHINE kind of makes this permanently available. You can click on the region of where you live and what you might need. You can do this anonymously, you know, you're just on there. So I think having this is a great feature, hitting, you know, a group of people who may need resources. Then the other one, though, as I say, going to a different group of folks who are participating, is they actually are incredibly transparent about, like, what are we doing with your information? Here's where we've presented. They actually have the abstracts with PDFs. Down here they have the articles they've presented. Again, you can kind of see who's involved in all these things. Some nice infographics down here. To download the infographic, click here. So I think there's just something so, as I say, very transparent, very open and also very, like, respectful, right? Like, we're acknowledging that people who participate in the study might be interested in these things, might want to know about this, might be grad students who are thinking of project ideas, might be people who haven't yet started a higher education but are interested and like, oh, wow, I didn't even know you could study these kinds of things. I would love to go and, like, do this, right? And then they also have a Google group down here. It says if you would like to keep in touch about up-to-date SHINE results and dissemination activities, please join our Google group. So for people who are really wanting to be on it. Is that there? Oh, and then they do have their social media. So they are on Facebook and Twitter. Yeah.
Because there's a lot of ways to stay involved with participants. But how does that work with kind of like confidentiality? Because I guess it's voluntary participation and connection tools.
Right.
I'm just wondering how that works.
Yeah, that's a really important point. They do, from the studies I've seen, I am not officially involved with SHINE, I just admire their website. But usually there's now some scripts around talking people through what does this mean, how might you do this, you know, do you want to create a fake name or an avatar? I think those kinds of things are pretty standard for people who are running these kinds of here's how to stay in touch. And I think, again, that's a great idea. Like, it's just kind of, in the work that I do, which is less, as I say, involved in online, we'll often talk people through scenarios, like if you have in the consent form, you know, being associated with a study might let people know that you're on probation or something like talking through with people how they might explain to people their study participation, or, you know, what is disclosed kind of by virtue that you're in the study versus what you could choose to tell people a study is about, or but yeah, that's clearly important here since everybody who is enrolling in the study is identifying with some sort of trans identity. Okay, anything else on SHINE? I'm a big fan. Okay, so this is the one I wanted to talk to you about. I'll tell you kind of the longer story where we have a research article that directly informed some really amazing work by a community group. So just to talk through again, I know we have people who are sitting pretty far away. So the top slide here is a graphic. We have 1 woman here, 3 women here, and it says 1 in 4 women has a family member in prison. Over on this side, this woman, it says she is fighting mass incarceration every day, #stand with her. Down below, today 1 in 4 women has a family member in prison. We #stand with her, and then more information. I'm going to take you to this website in a minute. And then this is the article that provided the 1 in 4 women has a family member in prison, which was Chris Wilderman from here, along with Hetty Lee and some other co-authors. And so the title of the article, which came out in 2015, is Racial Inequalities in Connectedness to Imprisoned Individuals in the United States, published in the Dubois Review, Social Science Research on Race. There is the full citation if people would like that. So the story about this, the way this all kind of came together, I played a supporting role, which I'm very excited about. So I'm on the board of the group that runs these, that ads are for. It's called the Essie Justice Group, as I say. We'll go to their website in a second. And Essie is a group that is raising awareness and community among women who have an incarcerated loved one. The executive director is Gina Clayton. It's based in Oakland, California. They're doing phenomenal work. I would love to talk to you more about all this. When I say I'm on the board, actually, Gina is very astute. She has 2 boards. One is a fundraising board, which is a board I'm not on because I'm useless when it comes to those things, but she also has a scientific advisory board. That's the one I'm on. And so Gina would convene the scientific advisory board just to kind of like stay abreast of the issues, right? And so when I knew from being friends with Chris and Hetty that this article was being prepared and coming out, I let Gina know because Gina was always saying to me, like, I am the research person on her scientific advisory board, and she's like, I need a number. Like, I really need a number. I'm trying to, like, communicate our message, communicate how important this is. I go and I talk to people who are potentially interested in giving us, you know, significant amount of funding for our work, but then they always say, well, how many people does this impact? And I'm like, I can't tell you that. So she's like, let me know when there's a number. So I got in touch. I'm like, guess what? There's going to be a number. It's very exciting. So the way that Gina, and again, I want to give a lot of credit to Gina Clayton, last name, for the way she processed this. Because what she did is I let her know, okay, there's this article that's going to come out. It has a number for you. And she's like, great, I want to really understand that number, and I want everyone in my staff to understand that number. And by the way, I didn't come up myself with, like, here's the number. I was like, it's about the numbers, right? Like, there's somebody trying to, like, concretize this and get some counts for you. So I got a copy of the article prior to its publication, which again is this kind of like, what do we need to be willing to do as researchers, right? Hetty and Chris and everybody were fine sharing a copy of the manuscript with us. I sent it to Gina, she shared it with her group, and then she convened a meeting with the scientific advisory board and her key staff where I came and we talked through, like, okay, what is this article actually saying, right? And these are all extremely smart people. Research articles are not, they're opaque, right? And unless that is your field of study, it's hard to decipher. So we kind of went through and started pulling things out, and it's Gina who honed in on this 1 in 4 number. She's like, wait, this seems like what I've been looking for, right? And this is in the course of us talking through, like, what does this article mean? So then Gina arranged a phone call with Hetty and Chris, who had kind of a whole second conversation with her, again, because she was really wanting to say, like, I want to use this number with confidence. And the reason I'm kind of emphasizing these things is I think that sometimes community groups, like, when they're not coming from I mean, Gina went to Harvard for law school, so she has, like, an understanding of research in these things, right? But sometimes community groups won't know that that's what they really should have, right? Like, I want to use this number in confidence. I know it's not in your abstract. I know it's not in your title. Let me make sure I really understand what this is saying. So I think that that's something we can do with people, is really talk them through. So Hetty and Chris spent time on the phone with Gina and some of her people, like, really explaining to them, what does this number mean? How did we come up with this? What does it not mean, right? Like, why is it framed in this way? There are, of course, a million caveats and all these things. But getting to a point where Gina's like, okay, cool, you know, this is going to work for us, and I feel solid about what you're telling me is the research behind it. So then they used it. They came up with all of the cool, the graphics, the idea of how to use it. I'm going to show you a video in a second where they also bring that in. And the reason, though, that I put all of these is kind of this link, right? So this one directly uses the research, again, with no citation, whatever. You know, we need to know who came up with this. It's nice for us in this room to know. But for the person on the street who's going to take home one idea in their head, we want the idea to be that number and not like, oh, Chris Wildeman and Hetty Lee wrote this article, right? So they have this. But then they kind of move it here, so this is where it translates into, they did like a social media campaign about Stand With Her because they were applying to Google for funding, and so they wanted like lots and lots of people to vote for them, and you know, Google does this thing where they have like 10 groups and you could vote for your group, right? So they did the hashtag Stand With Her campaign around trying to get people like post pictures of yourself with why you stand with her, come on in, whatever. So linking it here, right, with the 1 in 4 family members, and then linking back up to this one that actually doesn't say anything about 1 in 4, but is still all in the same messaging. So I think that Gina and her group are just really brilliant in the way they conceptualized all of this, and I want to learn from them how, you know, maybe I could assist other groups who don't have quite the same capacities in this way. I do want to show you this video. We'll go to their website. I guess, too, this other thing of, like, where the number is so important and kind of links a lot, but also doesn't have to take up a lot of airspace. So this is Essie's message. Essie Justice Group harnesses the collective power of women with incarcerated loved ones. And then this is just a 2-minute video that I would like to show you now.
It feels empty. Just bring the system's neck. Just pound it into the ground. Just for a long time, I saw it like it was part of living. It's just a way of life, but it's so exhausting. The logistics, money and resources, it's just a huge, massive burden. Raising children, going to schools, and parent-teacher night, and it's just me. I feel really alone. I do.
Our criminal justice system isn't as fair as it should be. Mass incarceration makes our country worse off, and we need to do something about it.
Mass incarceration is a human rights issue. It is a race justice issue. It is an economic issue, and it's a women's issue.
Sisterhood is powerful.
My name's Karen.
Natasha Catalina Palacio.
Journey.
Sylvia Rubio. I have a son, husband, brother, sisters,
Fiance.
son, 2 brothers, niece, father, uncle, 2 cousins, and an aunt in prison. We are fighting to end mass incarceration.
Give people a moment on that. I personally get very emotional every time I see that video. Close it out. I encourage you to visit their website. So as I say, this all credit goes to Gina and Essie and the people who worked with them. But I just think it's such a helpful example as you see that the research findings, both the quadrupling of the prison population and then the 1 in 4, are like at the anchor, right? They like hold things together, but you literally don't even need to say them because what's important are the stories and the faces and all these things. So I just think the way that they figured out how to mesh those 2 things together is so powerful. One other piece on that, again, just to kind of like finish the story in some ways. So then Essie hosted a retreat that had a lot of women who came to it. Michelle Alexander is on her board, so she was there. But she also invited Hetty to come and present the research findings to the group. So again, just kind of finding these ways to like interweave the research, so between me going and explaining, okay, like here's an article, let's talk about it. I didn't even write it, but let me help you understand it, right? Then like the people who wrote the article being willing to take the time, an hour phone call is a lot. People know that our time is precious, right? But like, yeah, it's important to spend that time with folks. Then letting them take it and run it, right? Like Hetty and Chris did not approve any of this specifically, right? They're just like, no, that's great. You know what you're doing. Please go with it. And then Gina bringing Hetty back in, as I say, one to just like bring the weight of the researcher, talk about things, and again, then be available for anybody there who either wants more explanation of that or who herself is thinking of like going on to grad school or wants to be, Hetty's student or anything along those lines. So I think kind of that interweaving has just been really inspirational.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
So one thing I study is how activist groups use different media to address different audiences. And in the history of it, ACT UP is really important because you had people that were coming down from Madison Avenue. They were advertisers themselves, and they were able to translate their, medical research into graphic form. Obviously, they're using either they're somebody's trained and has an eye and knows what they're doing here. How do researchers access that kind of skills? And how does that happen?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it can happen in a variety of ways. Sometimes I was talking earlier today about grant writing and how sometimes you just need to put things into the budget. If there's any possibility of saying, if you're applying to a body that also believes that translating research is important, can you put something into the budget to just say we're going to hire somebody who can help us with this piece, right? So it can go all the way from that to finding, somebody who's willing to do this pro bono. I'm pretty sure that's how a lot of the Essie video came together, like just getting people who have the skills and are willing to donate them. Here on university campuses, I think accessing students who are actually studying these things or who are just talented in these things can be another vehicle. And then, down to maybe doing something a little more simply, a little more homegrown. But I would say, too, just watching things and, like, learning. Like, I'm trying to get much better about this. This is not an innate talent of mine in terms of presenting and, like, picking out what's important and figuring out what graphic to use. And so I'm very inspired by people like the Shine Study and, like, Essie Justice Group in terms of, like, seeing, as I say, I literally tear up and get the chills every time I watch that video. So I'm like, okay, these folks did something incredibly powerful. What do I take away from that in terms of figuring out how to translate other research findings? I don't know if anybody else has ideas on that, too. Maybe other people have tried different things of getting that expertise. Or, I think your point, too, is just that it is important, right? Like, especially these days, people are used to seeing things that are slick and look good, and, so we can't kind of get away with the cardboard cutout that maybe we did in the science fair before. So I think it is worth investing in, whatever that investment looks like. Yeah.
So, like, in this particular example, the members of the staff and involved with the organization were really attuned to the importance of research for getting this across.
Right.
And also had resources like you when kind of like a research advisory board. But I mean, I can think of a number of organizations who benefit from having this backbone, but like it's a lot of work from the organization itself. So like I'm thinking about what are better ways that academics can make sure that the information is getting to groups who don't have the staff or the time to do this kind of constant back and forth without being overbearing.
That's a great question. And I think, again, kind of the whole gist of what I'm trying to talk about today is like, okay, who's your audience? Like, does that audience, as you're kind of saying, do they know they should be your audience, right? Do they even, like, Gina specifically assembled this scientific advisory board knowing there are people like me who can't raise money for her but who can, like, orient her to this kind of stuff. Some people don't know that those things are out there and you know, looping back to, like, this is an opportune moment to help people understand what is research and how can it help you. So I think some, like, scanning the landscape sometimes, I came a lot from HIV prevention work, you know, and we were just constantly trying to see, like, are there groups out there who are doing things who need to know something that we've just learned? And if so, like, again, the onus is on us to go to them, right? Like, people at community-based organizations are just working their tails off. They have no extra bandwidth, and you don't want to be overly burdensome to them. But if you can figure out the connection, which we can, again, because that's why we do the work, right? Like, we think it's important, we know why it's important, can we, like, you know, invite them to a lunch, right? That's the other thing when talking about, like, incentivizing people to participate in research. Also, like, honoring community-based organizations who don't have as many resources. Like, can you bring them here and feed them a lovely lunch like we had today? That goes a long way with people who are, like, exhausted and underfunded, right? And I think then, like, having those discussions of, you know, here's what we think, always coming from a position of humility, right? Like, we have found something that we think would be useful to you in your work. You know, do you even want to talk about that? First of all, some people might not. But if they do, then, like, can we communicate together about why this is important? And then if it's mutually agreed that this could be useful or helpful, then kind of saying, so what do you see being something you could move forward? What do you see as something you think we could move forward? How can we help with any of that? And again, I think being on a campus where there's students is so wonderful because you probably could, like, assemble a little mini team to do a project, to, like, do a video for somebody or something like that. But I really appreciate your point in the sense that, like, so many organizations do not have that capacity right now. And I think just trying to think through, like, how can we not let that be the limiting factor? And again, it is where Gina's been such an inspiration to me because I think she does these things really, really well. And so I'm kind of clocking in, like, for other organizations I work with, like, are there things that I could be doing for them that she's showing me would be potentially helpful? I'll do one more example, which is very similar along these lines, so then we can kind of open up for questions and everything. This is back to, like, the whole community partners piece. So the Ella Baker Center, which is also based in Oakland, wanted to put out a report that they ended up titling, Who Pays the True Cost of Incarceration for Families? And the way they conducted the research for this report was to use community-based organizations to, like, access people who were actually living through the circumstances of having incarcerated family members, and some of those people were just reporting their own data. Some of those people were going out and interviewing other people they knew in that situation. The final report, I think, is very important in what it documents. You know, speaking to a room of researchers, I think, you know, the research is not, like, super rigorous, whatever, because of this way they chose to conduct it. And I don't think that has to take away from it at all. I think it's an important piece in the, you know, the scope of everything that we need around all of this. So one, just that, as engaging people in research as research partners and as people conducting research. But then what was really fantastic was when they did the launch of this report, which I attended, which I was so glad I did. So those are just two pictures. It was hard to decide what to show you all from this. I showed up at this thing, it was like at 7 o'clock at night on a weekday, and there were literally like 400 people there. It was insane. I was just imagining, can you imagine any of us, like, hey, I published an article, come to my lunch, you know? So just that, like the fact that I think, you know, using community-based researchers, like you're researching something that's of interest to community people, right? And they had really gotten the word out, people felt super invested, they were really excited about this. So they had tons and tons and tons of people show up for this thing, and they clearly had anticipated that because it was in a really appropriate space. It was very large. It could contain the crowd. And so they fed everybody dinner. Again, I think the importance of food when trying to, like, help people engage with research, engaging with food, again, as we saw, since we like lunch being served to us, other people like food being served to them too. So they had food out, but then they had these just cool, they had an entire section of the building that was all devoted to like infographics and these kinds of things. So like this man is like explaining things to people, but like lots of interactive stuff. It was just brilliant the way they broke down like what is this, what did we find, what are our findings, and a lot of that is in the actual report. But just putting things up on the wall, right? Like don't make people pick up the report and read it. Let them wander the room. Let them talk to each other. Let them interact with somebody who's there. It'll be like, this is the piece that I helped with. And people, again, were really into it, right? It wasn't like, oh, that's the research room, I'm going to stay over here by the food, right? Like, people were very, very interested and really wanting to learn. And then they also had a presentation, so these two people are starting off that. And it was just neat. It was like, you know, people who'd been responsible for organizing the report, the research heads of this. They had a round table then with people, like a panel kind of thing with people who were formerly incarcerated themselves or who had had incarcerated family members talking about the actual costs. So again, just kind of like really bringing it into like what does this mean for somebody living their life, and this constant kind of dialogue back and forth with the research findings. It was just, as I say, I was really moved by it and just sat there the whole time like, wow, like all of these people, you know, it was a very humbling moment, right? Like I went back to my colleagues the next day, I'm like, we have all this stuff like, oh, people don't know research, they don't understand research, they don't care about research. Like 400 people cared about research last night, you know, that's my bad if I can't like get that sort of engagement around things. So props to Ella Baker Center, props to Essie Justice Group, props to the Shine Study, props to Tazima. Those are the examples I brought to go through with you all, but as I say, I purposely left time for questions, so hopefully we'll have some of those. And then if you would like to get in touch with me, that is how you can do so. So, any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, on the issue of engaging community funds, I wondered if you had any experience with trying to develop systems that community members can select the research questions and research to this place.
I have not done that. Have you done that? Yeah, can you speak more to that?
At the moment, we're just looking at different systems, and I mean, there's a thing you can do through focus groups and so on, but I'm quite interested in the way in which you're using various kinds of social media sites, far more.
Right.
I'm trying to think through what response mechanisms we have there.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I like what you're saying almost as more like a crowdsource. I mean, we do things like, you know, as you're saying, pilot test, or, you know, we try to design questions, or we'll run people through the survey questionnaire and be like, does this make sense? Do you understand this? But I think that's a really great and important way. You're making me think, I think some ways that could be done is we have sometimes for other purposes brought in like community consultants. And again, this is getting back to this point of like paying people for their money and respecting them for their expertise, you know. So if we bring somebody in to kind of, usually for us it's more of an end product, like if we're going to go to do a community report back, we'll hire some community consultants to come in and look at the fact sheet we're going to deliver or something like that. And, you know, bring them in for a 1 to 2 hour meeting, feed them something and pay them for their time. So there could be something, you know, on a smaller scale to do around development of questions. But I love the idea of using some sort of media-based platform for that. Anybody have expertise in that?
I just had a follow-up question.
Yeah.
Are you talking about engaging with the group, like that research, like the participants?
Yeah, or who considers that they might be the public.
That's true.
Saying what you actually think about this, and what would be a better question for us to use attention with what the academic discourse time.
The only thing I can think of is like in like some of the immigration groups that are working on immigrant refugee resettlement. Like I know that I'm going to be going to a meeting where they will just like tell the people like what information some of the like refugee organizers need. So I imagine that kind of thing, but it's like, I don't know what it's like, but basically like deploying researchers to just absorb like
right
at these meetings.
Yeah.
One way, but I don't know what like a systematic way of.
Right. There is a little bit of dialogue to be done too around, one thing that people who are not trained as researchers, when they think of questions that are interesting, you know, often those aren't quite a research question, right? And I think getting back to this, like helping people understand what research is, what it can do, what it can't do, and that's always a very delicate conversation, but, you know, there's so much value in it, right? Because as we help people understand, well, I understand why this is interesting to you. Here's why it wouldn't quite work as a research question, but can we talk together to figure out what a research question would be that would support that? You know, that whole train of thought, I think is really valuable for the reason you're saying, that the researcher then is like better informed about why am I even studying this and is it important? And people who are being asked to participate in research or even just endorse research understand like why you're not studying this other thing that's actually really important to them.
It's like a research practice workshop model that kind of fits right here. And we have a manual you can download. It's free. 30 pages long, but it's a step-by-step process of how you invite people, you know, the whole stack.
That's cool.
Is there a social media platform developed for that?
No, so what it is just it's like basically a group meeting where you invite researchers as well as practitioners, whatever field you're in. So it's like social workers that use things to data. You come and you have a discussion, a consensus about what is relevant, what's useful, where to go, what research is still needed. It's a whole. Yeah, it's just one option.
Yeah. One thing I didn't speak about today, but that was a very common practice when I was at UCSF, is having a community advisory board. So that can be another place to kind of workshop, you know. When I was at UCSF, it was really helpful because they had a community advisory board for the entire Center for AIDS Prevention Studies, so each study didn't have to have their own CAB, which was really helpful because they are actually a significant investment. So, you know, that could be something like if a center has a CAB that can then, and, you know, I could take a questionnaire, I could take a recruitment flyer or something, or just go and say, like, here are the people I'm hoping will participate in this. What are your ideas about where I might find them and what I should say to them to ask them to participate? So that can be a useful resource, yeah.
I was just going to respond. I know that in the area of social entrepreneurialism, they use some of these design thinking models. The first step is empathize, and it's basically you go out and you do field work as if you're on like anthropology, and so you do a lot of discussing, and then before you even define what the problem is. And so oftentimes, I mean, the classic example, at the Parthenon, people were knocking off pieces of the Parthenon in order to take home. And after they kind of figured out, they reframed it. It wasn't a problem of vandalism. It was probably just wanted tokens, so they just put stones. They just littered stones out, and so people would just come. So they completely reframed the problem. It's not a security problem. So what does be applicable here? You go into community. Is the problem really drug addiction, or is it some other problem? And you talk to them, and you completely reframe the solutions that you bring in. So there are models from all kind of different places.
Yeah. Yeah.
Many of our studies, and I'm sure we all do, have oftentimes some very nuanced findings, and that are much more, that take a lot of translation, under these conditions, these interaction effects, and so forth. Pretty clear when it's 1 out of 4, when there's something really clear like that. Sometimes we try to avoid the real quick, simplistic interpretation of our studies. How do you think about that?
I think, well, so the 1 out of 4 is a good example in that if you ask Chris or Hetty, like when they first were writing this article, like that would not probably appear on their top. I actually think I asked them to send me in preparation for that list, for the first meeting that I had with Gina and her group, like, can you send me some takeaways from this? And I don't think the 1 in 4 made their list of like top 5 findings, you know. So I think that engaging groups to kind of sift through and, as I say, see what resonates. Like Gina grabbed onto the 1 in 4, and it isn't nearly that simple. Like, y'all can look at the article, you know, there are a lot of like, well, you look at this, look at that, and that's why she wanted to have all those follow-up conversations to be like, yeah, but if I put 1 on 4 in a poster, am I like, is this correct or is this not correct? So I think there's that piece of like sometimes the people doing the work know best what they're looking for, and if we're willing to take the time to look through with them, it may be something we didn't even think about. I guess I do think that that's kind of the best way to do it. I think, too, maybe in more nuanced findings, again, sometimes it's kind of more the implication. Like, is there a piece of something that is useful for a group that's trying to, like, advocate for a resource? Or, you know, do we really need, the details are very important, we know, as researchers along the way, but is there kind of, like, the more implication piece or whatever that people could take forward to be like, okay, you know, this research backs this up, right? Like to the extent that is necessary to prove like you should give us this funding, or that we need a farmer's market in this neighborhood or something like that. But I think that often I'm not the first one to see that in my own work, and I think most of us aren't if we're not people who are daily affected by certain things, and therefore need somebody who is to be like, that. That's important, that I need that. But it is tricky. I really liked that process. It was fun for me to take the article and sit down with Gina and her crew, because it was super challenging for me along these lines. And I recommend just trying that sometime and seeing what other people find in something that you thought you were an expert in. It can be really useful. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak to, so I, for example, do research that uses national data. I do not see things like community. There's a certain subset of the population that my research was necessarily a factor who I want to report back to specifically. And I just wondered if you had suggestions for best practices if you're trying to kind of engage in outreach or like kind of translate your research, but you don't have like a targeted audience.
Right, right. I think that's a great way to be thinking, like to not just be like, oh, this doesn't pertain to any group. So, and I think, well, the 1 in 4 again actually would be a good example of that. They were using kind of national survey data to get at that. So finding, so your findings apply to like say a broad group in different places, but is there a group in a certain place that is working towards an agenda that finding would help advance? I don't know, what do you work on?
I mean, I guess so my unit of observation is like a city rather than like a person.
Right. Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, there can be good things there about, just like what kinds of spaces do people, I mean, again, I'm just going to riff on what your research probably has nothing to do with, but I do think this whole kind of, there's so many people working on the ground, whether they're local politicians, whether they're community group people, whether they're community members who are just like out there fighting the fight, who are trying to advance like some of these really basic things, like what do you need in the city, what kind of outdoor space, what kind of libraries, what kind of food markets. So I think in a case like yours, it probably would mean like maybe finding a place within what you're studying, like is it a specific city, is it a part of a city, and looking in to see are there groups there that are working on this issue. There could also be national associations that are working on things. Some of my UCSF colleagues do more kind of like correctional health work, and they've been great about like going to the conferences for correctional officers, right? And just being like, here's what we found about prisoner health, and here's what we found about your health when you work in a correctional facility. So sometimes it's something like that that's kind of not specific to one certain geographic spot, but that applies like across a profession or across an interest group that has some sort of national association. That might be another helpful way. Anything else?
A question, yeah. So for researchers applying for grants, there's often social impact is a large part. And why couldn't researchers just put out a large part or some part of their budget to do things? I mean, if you're looking at across the nation, what would a national billboard campaign cost you? That you just choose a number of cities and you're going to post it's really a very simple finding, and so there are people out there and you catch a buzz. And are researchers thinking about using that part of their research grant to really do the social impact?
Yeah. I like where you're heading in that because I think some people do, but not a lot of people do. But the more that we try to do it, the more legitimacy it gains, right? And like the more that just becomes the norm of like, yes, you should do this. And I think you're right. More and more funding groups want to see something around that. They don't necessarily expect you to include it in budget, but when you do, it's like, oh yeah, this stuff costs money, right? So I think planning from the beginning. I think there's also something in all of this that I really like around holding ourselves accountable to the people that we're going to be working with in whatever direction, and that idea that, okay, at the end of this, I'm going to have to report back to the community, or I'm going to have to do this thing, really keeps you honest about, like, all right, let's do it, let's conduct this research, let's make sure it's solid, let's, like, make sure we did it properly so that when I'm later standing in this rec room explaining to people how we recruited, they're not going to be like, what? Why did you do that? So I think that kind of forward planning and allocation of resources is important and a great way to start raising the legitimacy and justification.
Is it your sense from the big grant that you applied for that when they talk about broader impact, it's still focused on publications?
I think that depends a lot on the funder. I've gotten most of my funding from National Institutes of Health, so I speak mainly from them. And I do they want publications, but when you're actually telling them what will happen, it's like, we will publish in peer-reviewed journals and present at academic conferences, and we will and then you get more elaborate in the later piece, because I think they expect those things first off, right? And they do want to see the community impact piece. So I recommend at least for NIH and depending on the funder you're applying to, like being a little more concrete about what that's going to look like. Like we often put in the grant proposal, you know, if we're going to convene a CAB and those kinds of things, like spelling them out. One, for the review purpose, but again, two, for the accountability, and three, for like the budget. Like we would like to give our CAB members dinner, so here's the line item for that. And I think that just kind of, they help us all start to make that more pro forma so that people won't be tripping over it forever. Thank you all so much.